Certainly. Here is Section 1, minimum 700 words, of the story titled, Humans were considered primitive until the Galactic War reached Earth. ##### Section 1, The View from the Stars, Humanity Through Alien Eyes. In the grand halls of the Galactic Confederacy, an alliance of hundreds of sentient species, each with civilizations stretching back tens of thousands of years, Earth was little more than a dot. A green-blue anomaly nestled in the Orion Spur, orbiting a G-type main sequence star, dismissed by most xenoanthropologists as undeveloped and chaotically self-destructive. The prevailing opinion in the Confederacy was that humanity, while biologically intriguing, lacked the social and technological maturity to be considered relevant in galactic affairs. The classification systems of the Confederacy were meticulous. Civilizations were ranked on a 6-tier scale from proto-sentient tribal societies to advanced, hyper-civilized Type 6 collectives with mastery over time-energy manipulation and pan-dimensional economics. Humanity, as of its last formal classification review, was a Category 3A proto-spacefaring primate-type culture, 1 step above domesticated and 3 below first contact eligible. That label, *3, a primate *, became something of a running joke among Confederacy scholars. Observational platforms orbited Earth cloaked in quantum veils. For decades, non-interference teams monitored Earth's broadcasts, environmental patterns, and socio-cultural evolution. Most reports submitted to the Galactic Senate were dismal. The species called humans appeared volatile, tribal, and warlike. They used limited nuclear weapons on their own kind. They worshipped invisible gods, built borders on a shared planet, and devoted enormous resources to sport, entertainment, and status symbols. Their leadership systems were chaotic, often irrational, and their global priorities shifted with the temperament of a few dominant factions. To the sterile logic of the Confederacy, humanity was a failure waiting to happen. They burn fuel for transportation, one report scoffed. They're centuries from post-scarcity equilibrium. They use emotional instinct to make command decisions, another concluded. Highly unstable. Best left isolated. Yet there were whispers in darker corners of the Confederal research halls. Among a few fringe observers, classified as emotive sympathizers and often ridiculed by the mainstream, there was talk of something rare in humanity, resilience. One such observer, a Xantari archivist named Kelroa, argued that humans were not primitive, they were untested. In her archived report, she documented how the species had overcome extinction events, climatic collapses, and internal genocides, only to rebuild stronger each time. She pointed to their art, their mythology, their capacity to form attachments and die for beliefs that had no measurable benefit. She quoted a particular Earth phrase that puzzled her superiors, *the harder we're hit, the harder we fight. But her warnings were ignored. The prevailing belief was that humanity's development curve was unsustainable. Their environment was degrading. Their tools were crude. Their bodies frail. Their minds disordered. Perhaps in a few thousand years, they might be ready for the galactic stage, if they hadn't destroyed themselves by then. In fact, there had once been a proposal for uplifting. The Kalari, a benevolent aquatic race, offered to discreetly introduce fusion tech and quantum medicine to Earth's elite scientists. But the proposal was voted down by a margin of 7,432 to 18 in the Senate. The reasoning was brutal in its efficiency. The primates are not ready. Their warlike nature would turn our gifts into weapons. And so Earth remained unvisited, uninvited, watched, but never warned. The Confederacy maintained its veil of silence while humanity clawed its way upward, dreaming of the stars and unaware that the stars had already noticed them, and laughed. Then came the war. The Varkal swarm appeared without warning, without preamble, without diplomacy. A biomechanical force from beyond map space, they consumed star systems like locusts on cosmic scale. No treaties. No compromise. Only assimilation or annihilation. The Confederacy, long steeped in protocol and debate, faltered. By the time the Senate declared full-scale mobilization, hundreds of outer systems had gone dark. The swarm adapted to energy weapons. They countered shield harmonics. They overwhelmed with speed, numbers, and raw hunger. In desperation, worlds once arrogant were now burning. Peaceful species known for their love of music and poetry were learning to fight with weapons older than their languages. Military colonies were activated. Refugees streamed across the stars. Earth remained untouched. The Varkal hadn't yet reached the Sol system, and the Confederacy had no intention of warning humanity. Why would they? A primitive world of barely spacefaring bipeds could offer no meaningful resistance, and bringing Earth into the conflict would only result in one more dead world. But fate, ever the wild card, had different plans. A damaged Confederacy dreadnought, ambushed in a deep space battle, was forced to make an emergency jump through uncharted space. Its engines barely functioning, navigation lost, hull breached in dozens of sectors, it crash-landed on Earth. In the Arctic. Within hours, Earth's militaries detected the anomaly. A massive metallic object slammed into the ice, giving off non-terrestrial energy readings. NORAD, NATO, China, and Russia all scrambled. The veil was torn. The war had reached Earth. And humanity would never be underestimated again. Let me know when you're ready for Section 2, minimum 700 words, and I'll continue the saga. Absolutely. Here's Section 2, minimum 700 words, of the story. Humans were considered primitive until the Galactic War reached Earth. ##### Section 2, the spark falls to Earth, when the war reached us. The ship fell from the heavens like a wounded god. To those watching the night sky from remote radar installations in Greenland and Siberia, it was first mistaken for a meteor, or worse, a missile. It tore through the upper atmosphere at impossible speed, skipping off the thermosphere like a stone on water before plunging into the deep, frozen interior of the Arctic Circle. The impact registered on every seismic sensor from the Yukon to Scandinavia. It cracked glaciers, vaporized ice in a 10-mile radius, and left a crater glowing with residual radiation that no nation could identify. Within minutes, global satellite networks triangulated the location. Within an hour, scrambled aircraft and unmanned drones converged over the zone. The object was massive, larger than any known man-made craft, partially buried under tons of frozen debris, leaking strange heat signatures. What it wasn't was human. Within 6 hours, a multinational task force had been deployed. The United States, Russia, China, the EU, and a small contingent of NATO forces established a perimeter, each wary of the others, all too aware of the implications. Cameras fed back grainy footage of the wreck. The hull was alien, literally. Not alien in design, but alien in nature. Nothing in the periodic table could explain its shifting, semi-organic alloys. The ship breathed, pulsing with decaying power. It looked less like a vessel and more like something grown and grafted into shape. Then a hatch opened. Amidst the swirl of snow and steam, a tall figure emerged. It stumbled into the cold air, smoke curling from wounds on its translucent skin. The soldiers leveled weapons instantly, unsure whether to shoot or speak. But the being raised one trembling limb and fell to its knees. Its body was clearly damaged, punctured by shrapnel, fluids leaking in thick rivulets. A translator node, implanted in its throat, buzzed to life. Asterisk warning, they asterisk. The alien collapsed before it could finish. The world changed in that moment. News of the crash was suppressed, but rumors leaked. Something had fallen. Something had been found. Speculation ran wild, experimental weapons, deep space probes, even a Black Ops project. But behind closed doors, the truth was being dissected. And the corpse was not alone. Before its death, it had activated a beacon, a memory core, a crystalline cube embedded with compressed holographic data. What Earth scientists and analysts decoded in the following days would shake every foundation of belief. Images of starscapes unfamiliar to even the most advanced observatories. Maps of planetary systems with military notations. Alien species engaged in battle. And then, the Varkhal. Video feeds, some from ground level, others from orbit, showed them, biomechanical nightmares, swarm-based organisms that moved like liquid steel and tore through defenses like locusts through crops. They came in overwhelming numbers, each one genetically programmed for destruction, consuming entire ecosystems, dismantling civilizations, and adapting on the fly. There was no diplomacy. No language. No goal beyond expansion and assimilation. Earth was on one of the mapped projections, labeled simply 3A492. No date. No path. But circled in red. Marked for future incursion. The Galactic War had not just found Earth. It had planned for Earth. What followed was the fastest unification of the human race in recorded history. Military leaders, political officials, scientists, and intelligence officers gathered at the newly formed Global Crisis Command, hidden beneath the Swiss Alps. The data had spoken plainly. Earth would not be spared. The Varkhal were coming. And then, they did. 3 weeks after the Arctic crash, atmospheric sensors in South America picked up an unidentified object falling from orbit, fast, irregular, with no heat shielding. It struck the Amazon rainforest, impacting with such force that the ground quaked across Brazil and Peru. Communication was lost with every outpost in the region within an hour. Drone footage revealed the truth. Something was spreading, a black, fungal-like sprawl that consumed plant life, wildlife, even the soil itself. Trees twisted into grotesque shapes. Rivers turned viscous. Biological readings showed alien DNA sequences integrating with native species. The Varkal had seeded Earth. Local military responses were futile. Bullets slowed the creatures down, but only temporarily. They adapted. They regenerated. And most terrifyingly, they learned. The United Nations declared a state of global emergency. The Global Defense Pact, GDP, was ratified. Old enemies became allies. For the first time in human history, every military, scientific, and economic asset was put toward a single objective: survival. Earth's greatest minds were brought together. Weapons once kept in theoretical white papers were accelerated into prototypes. Nuclear-capable nations began sharing research, preparing for joint strikes. For once, secrecy was secondary to necessity. And then, humanity struck back. Operation Crimson Thorn was launched. A multinational special forces unit was deployed into the heart of the Amazon infestation zone with orders to retrieve a live specimen or die trying. Of the 30 who went in, only 6 returned. But they brought with them a living Varkal larva, contained in a cryocapsule rigged to detonate if breached. Biologists and engineers worked around the clock. What they discovered defied reason. The Varkal weren't machines. They weren't alive, either. They were a hybrid, organisms built to evolve in real time, absorbing traits from whatever they consumed. But they had limits. Patterns. Predictable metabolic weaknesses. Within weeks, Earth began testing prototype weapons tailored to exploit these weaknesses. Microwave disruptors. Chemical destabilizers. Directed EMP bursts. Even crude nanotech lures designed to bait them into traps. And in a small but symbolic victory, Earth launched its first successful orbital kinetic strike, a Rods from God barrage, on the center of the Amazon hive. The impact vaporized the ground for miles. Thermal scans showed Varkal activity dropped to 0. One nest destroyed. The Confederacy had watched in silence. Their cloaked satellites observed the battle. Primitive bipeds, using crude tech, had done what dozens of advanced worlds had failed to do. They'd held the line. And they'd won. Earth was no longer a dot on a map. It was a threat. It was a wild card. And the galaxy had finally noticed. Let me know when you're ready for Section 3, minimum 700 words. Where humanity takes the fight into space and begins rewriting the rules of the war. Absolutely. Here is Section 3, minimum 700 words, of the story. Humans were considered primitive until the Galactic War reached Earth. #### Section 3, Humanity Strikes Back, Rage in the Void. The world was no longer the same. The Arctic crash and the Varkal infestation in the Amazon had achieved something no summit, treaty, or alliance ever could: they unified Earth. The petty arguments of nations fell away under the looming shadow of extinction. Borders became logistics routes. Rivals became allies. Former enemies stood shoulder to shoulder, not for diplomacy, but for survival. But humanity was never meant to be passive. Earth's response had been instinctive and defensive, yes, but now came the second phase: retaliation. The newly formed Global Defense Pact, GDP, expanded into orbit. Space was no longer just a frontier, it was a war zone. With access to recovered alien technology from the Arctic crash and dissected Varkal remnants from the Amazon hive, human scientists and engineers entered a golden age of hybrid innovation. We weren't building like the Confederacy. We didn't have their elegance or their patience. But we had one thing they never did: urgency. From decommissioned space stations and orbital junkyards came the first generation of Earth's combat fleet, Project Skyhammer. A ragtag fleet of retrofitted rockets, modular destroyers, and magnetic accelerator gunships. Ugly, patchwork vessels, most barely spaceworthy by Confederacy standards, but fast, hard-hitting, and loaded with experimental weaponry. A new branch of the GDP was born: Void Command. Recruitment exploded. The training was brutal, combining special forces conditioning with zero-gravity warfare, bioresistance testing, and neural latency training. Most candidates washed out. Some died. The ones who remained became legends: Earth's first interstellar marines. The world watched as USS Vengeance, a 3-kilometer rail cannon battleship powered by a fusion core stolen from the Arctic wreck, left orbit with a fleet of smaller corvettes. Their mission: strike a Varkal outpost on Europa-class moon Raxvel 9, where signals indicated a new swarm was gestating. No one expected them to survive. They didn't just survive. They won. Human tactics were unpredictable. Where Confederacy forces relied on formation, shields, and pre-approved response matrices, humanity fought like cornered beasts. They used flanking maneuvers, guerrilla drops, sacrificial drones, and suicide rams. They planted nuclear mines beneath the moon's surface and lured the Varkal into range. They disrupted swarm cohesion using erratic sound patterns and multi-spectrum pulses. The final kill came not from a high-tech weapon, but from a kamikaze run. A human pilot named Commander Rachel Damasio manually drove a damaged gunship into the primary spire of the Varkal biomass cluster and detonated her core reactor. Thousands died. The moon was left in ruin. But the swarm was wiped clean. And the galaxy noticed. The Confederacy Senate, until then content to sit and observe the humans from their fortified worlds, could no longer ignore Earth. The first diplomatic envoy, heavily armed and accompanied by AI proxies, made contact in lunar orbit. Their first words were simple: "We did not expect you to survive." The GDP's response was even simpler: "We did not intend to ask permission." Earth was offered a limited observer seat in the War Council. Not as equals. Not yet. But as tactical advisors, with access to certain restricted databases and off-world strategic operations. The Confederacy still viewed us as unstable, dangerous, but also necessary. Because something had changed. The swarm, for the first time, began to hesitate. Data streams showed Varkal movement patterns shifting. They began avoiding systems with human signals. Ships that bore the triangular insignia of Earth's Void Command saw fewer engagements. It wasn't out of respect. It was fear. The Varkal were evolving, and that meant they were learning. They'd studied the Confederacy for centuries, mimicking their weaknesses, penetrating their defense protocols. But humanity was different. We were illogical. We adapted faster. We turned our pain into tactics, our losses into lessons. We built weapons from scrap and made gods out of martyrs. Our unpredictability was the one variable the swarm couldn't assimilate. And so, the Confederacy began adopting human tactics. Confederacy fleets started integrating wild teams, small units of human advisors embedded into alien formations. Our soldiers taught them how to fight dirty, how to push when wounded, how to break the rules. A Sarnari war admiral, after losing 3 of her own battles but winning her first with a human-led squad, said it best. They are not warriors. They are storms wrapped in flesh. By the time the Battle of Cradle's Fall occurred, the largest Varkal invasion force ever recorded, Earth was no longer the backwater world it had once been. 3 full human fleets joined the Confederacy Armada above the planet of Iskareth Prime. And it was humans who held the line. Human warships took the brunt of the first swarm wave. Human ground forces led the charge when the planetary shields failed. Human engineers set off a chain of orbital detonations that collapsed a Varkal dread cluster into its own gravity well. Losses were catastrophic. But the Varkal were pushed back. And in the aftermath, for the first time in Confederacy history, a human commander, Admiral Sanaa Yusuf, was awarded the Cross of Infinity, their highest honor. In her speech, she said, "You looked down on us because we bled. You called us primitive because we broke things. But that's what survival looks like. We weren't waiting for your approval. We were waiting for war." Earth's rise wasn't over. But the galaxy now knew. Humanity didn't need to be invited. We'd already kicked the door in. Let me know when you're ready for Section 4, minimum 700 words, where Earth doesn't just survive or fight, but leads. Certainly. Here's Section 4, minimum 700 words, of the story. Humans were considered primitive until the Galactic War reached Earth. #### Section 4, The Rise of Earth, Fear the Fire We Bring. The war didn't end with a single climactic victory. The Varkal weren't vanquished in one final battle. No flags were raised over smoldering ruins. This was not a war of symbols or ceremonies. It was a war of attrition, of hard choices, of sacrifice. And humanity, for all its so-called primitiveness, endured it all. By the time the Confederacy declared the swarm threat contained, more than 60% of its member worlds were either destroyed, evacuated, or biologically compromised. Massive sectors of the galaxy were rendered uninhabitable. But one constant remained: the humans kept fighting. And when the swarm finally fractured, splintered by Earth-led campaigns in the Lyri Expanse and the collapse of its breeding moons, it was humanity that stood in the center of the battlefield star. Not untouched, not unscarred, but undefeated. The Confederacy, once ancient and untouchable, was humbled. Their palatial worlds have been saved not by their age-old wisdom or diplomatic nuance, but by those wild, untamed, unpredictable primitives from Earth. The irony didn't go unnoticed. Earth was no longer a backwater. It had become a power. But with victory came questions. What happens when the storm you invited inside refuses to leave? The Galactic Senate convened an emergency summit to discuss post-war reconstruction. Delegates from the surviving worlds met in a once unthinkable location, New Geneva, Earth's capital in the newly terraformed orbital ring known as Solnet Station. Earth hosted the summit. Earth drafted the agenda. Earth, once uninvited to the galactic table, now sat at its head. The aliens were wary. Some called for a recontainment protocol, proposals to limit humanity's technological expansion and restrict further colonization. Others, quietly, feared Earth might rise to become a conqueror. But humanity didn't seek to rule the galaxy. We sought to survive it. And in doing so, we changed it. The post-war years saw Earth lead efforts in rebuilding shattered colonies. Our engineers, trained in chaos and desperation, rebuilt cities faster than any Confederacy protocol allowed. Our diplomats, once ignored, now brokered peace between rival species. Our culture, raw and vibrant, spread like wildfire. Children on distant planets began wearing Terran clothing. Alien bands covered Earth's music. Human fiction, epics of resistance, of rebellion, of underdogs who defied fate, resonated across species. The concept of the HFY mythos, humanity, fuck yeah, emerged in galactic literature, not as an insult, but as admiration. Even war doctrine changed. Confederacy fleets, once rigid and ceremonial, adopted flexible strike formations inspired by Earth's asymmetric tactics. Military academies taught the Demasio maneuver, the kamikaze run that destroyed a Varkhal hive cluster. Think like a Terran became common among commanders facing unconventional threats. We didn't just change the battlefield. We changed the galaxy. But Earth didn't forget its roots. It remembered the years of silence, when our signals were ignored. When we were considered savages, not worth saving. It remembered the look in the eyes of alien diplomats who once feared catching diseases just from breathing our air. And now those same diplomats offered treaties, partnerships, alliances. Humanity accepted. Cautiously. Strategically. But we built our own empire too. From the ruins of conflict rose the Terran Accord, a federation of Earth-led colonies and war-forged allies. Not tyrants, but defenders. Not overlords, but guardians. We seeded planets once tainted by the swarm. We resurrected moons, built cities in the bones of shattered ringworlds. And we trained our own fleet, *** the Fireborn Armada ***, forged in memory of every world the Confederacy abandoned and every soldier Earth buried. In one generation, Earth went from isolation to influence. We did not seek vengeance. But we never forgot. Not every alien world welcomed us. Some still whispered that we were dangerous. That our passion, our fury, our need to win made us unstable. That we fought too hard. Felt too deeply. Took too much pride in violence. And maybe they were right. But that same fire, the one they feared, was the reason they still had planets to return to. Families to rebuild. Stars to call home. In a broadcast sent across the known galaxy, the newly appointed Earth High Admiral, once a refugee child from the Amazon outbreak, spoke plainly. We were called primitive. We were laughed at, dismissed, and forgotten. But when your skies burned, we came. When the swarm reached your worlds, we bled beside you. And when the fires faded, it was our hands rebuilding your homes. You feared us because we feel. Because we rage. But you forget. That same rage is what held the line when no one else would. So yes, fear us. Fear what we bring. But never again call us primitive. And with that, Earth entered a new age. Not as a forgotten dot on a star map. Not as a species ignored for its flaws. But as a force that had stood against the end of everything, and refused to break. The galaxy would never be the same again. And Earth would never stand alone. Let me know if you'd like a full compiled version of all 4 sections in one file or text block, or if you'd like a title image / poster style scene inspired by the story.